Snow does not fall in the Dragoon Mountains. It comes sideways, like it has somewhere to be and you are in the way. For 3 days, the wind has screamed against the shutters of a lone cabin on the slope, burying everything in white. Inside, a tall woman stands at the frosted window, arms crossed, breath fogging the glass as she stares into the void. At the tree line, a shape lies half buried, not a branch. An arm reaches out from the drift. She steps back, then forward. Her hand finds the rifle above the hearth. She pulls on her coat and pushes into the storm. Snow reaches her hips. The cold bites through wool and skin. She fights her way to the shape, drops to her knees, and presses 2 fingers to the throat. A pulse, weak, alive. She pulls back the frozen tunic. Dark blood crust around a broken shaft jutting from his side, an arrowhead of dark stone, carved with strange, deliberate precision. The wind dies for one breath. In the sudden quiet, she feels it eyes on her from the trees, watching. She lifts her head slowly, rifle still in one hand. Snow does not fall in the Dragoon Mountains. Arrives. It comes down sideways, like it has somewhere to be and you are in the way. Ingrid Halvorsen knew this better than most. She knew it the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat in a silent room. The way she knew which floorboard groaned near the hearth. The way she knew, without needing to check the calendar nailed above the door, that today was the 3rd day of the storm. 3 days. 3 days of white noise pressing against the windows, like something alive, something patient. She stood at the window now, arms crossed, breath fogging the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, ghostly, doubled by the frost, tall. That was the first word people used. Not her name, not even a greeting sometimes. Just tall, said like an accusation, said like a diagnosis. 6 feet and 2 inches of woman, standing where a woman apparently wasn't supposed to stand. Broad through the shoulders. Strong through the arms in a way that unsettled men who liked their women delicate. Giant, they'd called her back in Missouri. Not to her face. Except when they were drunk. Except when they thought the dark would hide their cruelty. It never did. Her father used to say the Halvorsen height skipped a generation and then arrived all at once, like the family kept it in a jar somewhere, and finally let it loose the day she was born. He'd stood a head above every other man in their Minnesota township, and folks had called him Big Ole instead of his given name for so long, that even her mother slipped sometimes, calling him that at the supper table, like it was tenderness instead of habit. He hadn't minded. That was the thing. Remembered clear as how her father wore his away. Some men wore a good coat, comfortable, unbothered, like the shape of him, had never once needed anyone else's approval to feel correct. He used to lift her onto his shoulders when she was small. We soon outgrown all the world will only ever look crowded with people who didn't know how to take up their own space properly. She used to think she'd grow into that same ease eventually. That the discomfort was only a phase of girlhood, something she'd shed away the ache snake sheds skin too small for what it's become. She was 29 now. Still waiting on that shedding. Some days, Lars used to remind her of her father sometimes, in small ways. Not the size Lars had been solidly built, but unremarkable. A head shorter than her, always laughing about having married up in more ways than one. But he'd carried that same unbothered ease, that same refusal to apologize for what the world found strange about the two of them together. He used to walk a half step behind her in crowded places, not out of deference, but so he could watch people's faces change when they realized how wrong their first assumption had been, the assumption that a woman built like Ingrid needed protecting, rather than the reverse. Maybe that was why she'd loved him so fast, so completely. Because he was the second man in her whole life who'd ever looked at her and seen someone worth standing beside, instead of someone to be measured, joked about, or feared. Missouri had tried to take that from her. Had almost succeeded some nights. She exhaled. Watched her breath bloom and fade against the glass. 29 years old, a widow for 3 of them, and still some nights. She heard that word chasing her through her own dreams like a dog that wouldn't stop barking. Giant. She turned from the window. Fire cracked and spat behind her, throwing orange light across a cabin built by her own hands. Well, her hands and Lars's. Mostly hers, if she was honest, because Lars had been gentle in ways that made him better with words than with an axe. He'd loved her anyway. Loved the size of her hands. Loved that she could split logs he could barely lift. Loved her like she was something rare instead of something wrong. The cabin itself told the story of that love, if a person knew how to read it. The doorframe stood taller than any doorframe had a right to be, because Lars had built it for her before he'd built it for himself. measuring twice 6 inches shoulders instead of his own. The shelves along the far wall set a hand's width higher than most women would have hung them, and she'd stopped noticing that fact years ago, the way a person stops noticing the specific shape of their own kindness, once it's simply become the house they live in. She ran her palm along the edge of the mantel now, out of habit more than need, feeling the grain of wood he'd sanded smooth the autumn before he died. Some nights the cabin felt like a museum built to a single exhibit, a marriage, preserved, dusted, walked through in the dark. Other nights, it felt like the only place on earth that had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. And then the lung fever took him. Just like that. One winter he was there, telling her she was magnificent, and the next winter he wasn't there at all. 3 years now. 3 years of silence broken only by wind and wolves and the particular ache of being the only living thing for 20 miles in any direction. She had grown used to the sound of her own footsteps on the floorboards, the particular economy of a life lived for an audience of one. She talked to herself sometimes out loud, just to hear a human voice fill the cabin her own. Since no one else's was coming, she'd chosen it. That was the part nobody understood. She hadn't fled to the mountains because the world rejected her. She'd fled because, for once, she wanted to reject it first. The wind screamed against the shutters. Ingrid flinched, not from fear, from memory, because that scream sounded almost human, and something in her chest had learned a long time ago to brace whenever a sound came close to human and wrong. She pressed her palm flat against the window. Cold bled through the glass into her skin. Somewhere out there, the storm was eating the world alive. And somewhere out there, though she didn't know it yet, couldn't know it yet, a man was dying in the snow. The larder was full. That was something, at least. Dried venison, preserved berries dark as old blood, flour she'd milled herself from wheat she'd grown herself, because nobody was coming to save her if she ran short, and she'd learned that lesson early. She didn't fear for herself. She feared instead, in that strange, sideways way grief teaches a person to fear, for every creature caught outside tonight. The elk, the rabbits, even the wolves, though they'd never done her any kindness, because that was the thing about losing someone. It didn't make you harder, not really. It just rearranged where your softness went. Lars used to say she had a heart 3 sizes too big for a woman her size, which was already a saying something she missed his voice most at night. Missed it so specifically she could still hear the exact pitch of it, low and warm, curling around her name like smoke. Alara, no. Wait, Ingrid caught herself. Stopped her own name. She'd almost lost her own name for a second. Lost the fog of memory and fatigue and 3 days of screaming wind. Ingrid, she told herself. Ingrid Halvorsen, 29. Alive. Alone. She pressed her knuckles against her eyes until the disorientation passed. She needed sleep, except sleep hadn't come easy in 3 years, and a blizzard wasn't going to change that now. She lay down anyway, on top of the quilt instead of beneath it, boots still laced, the way she always slept during a bad storm, ready to move, though she couldn't have said toward what. Morning of the 3rd day arrived gray and thin, like broth stretched too far. The wind had dropped from a scream to a moan. Snow still fell, but softer now, lazier, like it had worn itself out trying to kill everything beneath it. Ingrid wrapped herself in wool, buckskin beneath, thick coat over. She scraped a circle of frost from the window with her thumbnail and peered out into a world gone completely white, white sky, white ground, white trees bent double under the weight of it. And there, at the tree line, a smudge. She almost dismissed it, told herself it was a fallen branch, told herself it was shadow playing tricks. Because shadows did that out here, twisted themselves into shapes that weren't real, shapes that made a lonely woman's heart stutter for no good reason. Except it didn't move like a branch. Except the shape had an arm. Her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs and stayed there. A man, or what was left of one. Her first instinct, and she hated this about herself, hated it even as it happened, was to step back from the window, let the curtain fall, pretend the frost hadn't cleared, and pretend she hadn't seen anything at all. Because this was Apache land. Had been for longer than anyone could count. Longer than the treaties that kept getting signed and broken, and Sagan-like promises made by men who didn't intend to keep them. A dead man near her cabin. An Apache man, if the fringe on his sleeve told her anything, a lone white woman. She knew exactly how that story would be told, whichever way it went. Knew it the way she knew the shape of trouble before it ever arrived at her door. Which was why every instinct in her body said close the curtain, except Lars's voice moved through her mind, then clear as if he stood beside her, warm breath against her ear the way it used to be. Every soul's worth saving, Ingrid, even when it's inconvenient. Especially then. She squeezed her eyes shut. Damn you, she whispered, to a man 3 years gone, to a mystery that still knew exactly how to move her. Damn you for being right even now. She pulled on her thickest gloves, wrapped a scarf twice around her throat. Took Lars's old rifle down from its pegs above the hearth, not for violence, she told herself, though her hands didn't entirely believe that, and stepped out into a world that wanted to kill her too. Snow to her hip in places, which for most women would have meant snow to the chest. But Ingrid's stride ate ground that would have swallowed a smaller person whole, and for once, just once, she was grateful for the body that had cost her so much back home. Because out here, size wasn't a curse. Out here, size was the only thing standing between a dying man and the grave. It hadn't fully died yet, and it found every seam in her coat, every gap where wool met skin, and needled through with a persistence that made her eyes water and freeze at the corners. She kept her head down, watching the ground, counting the smudge against the tree line as a fixed point, and nothing more, refusing to let herself think about what she'd find when she reached it. She reached him after what felt like an hour and was probably 4 minutes. Knelt in the snow beside him, rifle laid carefully to one side, young. That was her first real thought. Younger than she'd guessed from the window. Maybe 25 winters, if that. Dark hair matted by the out. A face, gone the color of old ash-bedded leggings. A tunic soaked through and frozen stiff. A broken bow lying splintered a few feet off, like it had fought something and lost. No horse anywhere. She reached out, hesitated. Touched 2 fingers to the side of his throat. They're faint. A pulse fluttering under her fingertips like a moth trapped behind glass. Alive barely. Well, she breathed, to no one, to the snow, to the wind that had finally, mercifully, gone quiet. You picked a hell of a place to almost die. She saw no wound at first glance, no obvious injury beyond the cold itself. But the way he lay curled inward, one arm tucked protectively against his side, told her a different story than exposure alone would write. Something else had happened to this man. Something before the storm ever touched him. Ingrid sat back on her heels and stared at him, and for one long, terrible moment, every argument she'd ever have with herself played out at once. If she left him, he'd be dead before noon. If she took him in, and he woke violent, she'd be dead before dark. If his people came looking, and they would come looking, men like this didn't simply vanish without someone noticing. They would find him inside her cabin, wounded, maybe worse. And what would that look like to warriors who had every reason already to hate a white face on their land? Every version of this ended badly, except leaving him. That one ended badly too. It just ended badly for him instead of her. Damn it all, she muttered, and the wind carried her voice off into the white nothing. Damn it straight to hell, because she already knew what she was going to do. Because she'd known it since the moment she saw the arm. Because some decisions aren't decisions at all. They're just the truth of who you are. Arriving a little late to introduce itself. She used her own shawl as a sling beneath his shoulders, dragged him inch by furious inch across snow that fought her for every foot of ground. He was dead weight, frozen muscle. A man built solid even now, even dying, even reduced to this. Her arms screamed. Her lungs burned raw with cold air, dragged too fast in too deep. But this was the one place in the world where her body had never once betrayed her. Where the strength that had made her a spectacle back home made her, out here, was simply capable. 50 yards to the cabin door. It felt like 50 miles. She counted her own footsteps to keep from counting anything else. To keep from thinking about how his skin had gone the wrong color. To keep from thinking about how still he'd become, how the fluttering pulse under her fingers might have already stopped, how she might be dragging a corpse home to bury instead of a man to save. 1, 2, 3. Keep moving. Keep pulling. 20. 21. Almost there. Almost her boot caught a hidden root beneath the snow, and she went down hard, one knee cracking against frozen ground, breath punched clean out of her chest. For a moment she just knelt there, gasping, snow soaking through her leggings, the man's weight still tangled in the shawl beside her. Get up, she told herself. Voice raw. Get up, Ingrid. He doesn't get to die because you decided to feel sorry for yourself in the snow. She got up. The last 30 yards were the worst. Her knee had already begun to stiffen, sending small bright warnings up through her hip with every drag, and the cabin seemed to recede rather than approach, the way distances sometimes do when a body is running on nothing but stubbornness. She fixed her eyes on the door handle, told herself that was the only thing left in the world that mattered, that small iron latch. Cold enough to burn, and pulled until her vision narrowed to a tunnel with the door at the far end of it, somewhere around the 12th or 13th step of that final stretch. She stopped thinking of him as a stranger at all. He became, instead, simply weight. She refused to set down the way a person carrying a full bucket of water across ice stops, thinking of the bucket as separate from themselves. Thinks only of balance, of the next foot forward, of the specific arithmetic of not spilling what mattered. She would examine that shift later, turn it over in her mind during quieter hours, and wonder what it said about her that her body had decided to save him before her mind had ever finished arguing about whether she should. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wall. She dragged him onto the rag rug before the hearth and collapsed beside him, chest heaving, every muscle in her body announcing its betrayal all at once. The fire had burned low while she was outside. Embers, mostly. The room already losing its heat to the cold, pressing in through every gap in the logs. First things first. She fed the fire before she fed anything else. Kindling, then larger logs, her hands trembling too hard at first to strike a proper spark. Because if the fire died, they both died, and there was no version of tonight where she let that happen. Only once flame caught properly. Climbing, hungry, throwing real heat back into the room, did she turn to the man on her floor, still. Too still. Skin the color of frosted marble. "No," she said, and this time her voice cracked down the middle. "No, you don't get to do this. Not after I carried you 50 yards through hell." His clothes had to come off, all of them. Frozen stiff, ice crystallizing in the seams, and there was no gentle way to manage it. She knew what this looked like. A woman alone, with a strange man's bare skin under her hands. Knew exactly how that story would sound, told wrong, told cruel, told by people who'd never once had to choose between propriety and survival. She didn't care survival won. It always won out here. She cut the frozen thongs with Lars's hunting knife rather than tear the hide, some instinct telling her this mattered to him, that even unconscious, even dying, a man's belongings held pieces of who he was. She worked fast, practical, her mind narrowing down to nothing but the next necessary motion. Blankets next. Everyone she owned, piled high, warm water. Soft rags to chafe circulation back into fingers, gone the color of bruised plums. His face up close surprised her, lean, high cheekbones. A jaw set even in unconsciousness, like he was still arguing with something. A small scar along his left temple, faded pale against sun-darkened skin. The kind of scar that told a story she'd never get to hear, unless he lived long enough to tell it. She was still working his left hand between both of hers, trying to coax warmth back into frozen fingers, when she shifted his weight to reach his other side, and felt it, something hard, buried, pressed against her palm through the blanket. She pulled the wool back, there tucked against his ribs, half hidden by the angle he'd fallen in, a broken shaft, splintered wood jutting maybe 2 inches from skin gone dark with frozen blood. An arrow, not the storm, then not exposure, not exhaustion. Someone had shot this man and left him to die in the snow like it was nothing at all. Oh, Ingrid breathed. Just that. One syllable, soft, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire, because this changed everything. Because a man caught in a blizzard was one kind of tragedy, and a man ambushed and left for dead was an entirely different one. Because now there were other people in this story, people with rifles or bows or whatever, had put that arrowhead 2 inches into his side. People who might still be out there. People who might come looking to finish the job. She sat back on her heels, breathed, made herself think instead of panic. Because panic never once split a log or built a cabin or dragged a dying man 50 yards through snow. Her knowledge of medicine came from her mother, mostly fevers, simple fractures, wounds that needed stitching but not much else. This an arrowhead, possibly barbed, lodged near organs she couldn't name with certainty. This sat somewhere past the edge of what she knew. Leave it in, an infection would take him slow. Pull it wrong, and he'd bleed out faster than she could stop it. There was no good answer here, just 2 bad ones, and she had to choose between them with hands that were still shaking from the cold. He groaned then, a low sound dragged up from somewhere deep. His eyelids fluttered, dark eyes unfocused, staring at her ceiling like it belonged to another world entirely. He said something, a word, maybe 2, in a language she didn't know, rough, strained, urged in a way that raised the hair on her arms even though she couldn't understand a syllable of it. "Easy," she whispered, more to steady herself than him. "Easy now, you're safe, for now, for now." She heard the qualifier even as it left her mouth, and she didn't take it back because it was the only honest thing she had to offer him. She sterilized Lars's sharpest blade in the fire, watched the metal glow faint orange before she pulled it back, hands trembling in a way she hoped he was too far gone to notice, because if he woke properly, if he understood what she was about to do, if those dark eyes focused on her hands holding a knife near his ribs, she didn't finish the thought, couldn't afford to. She cut away the buckskin around the wound instead, careful, slow. The flesh beneath was swollen, angry. A deep purple red that told her infection was already circling like something patient and hungry. She probed gently, tried to find the angle, the depth. He cried out sharper this time, more awake than she'd expected, and his whole body arched off the floor. "I'm sorry," she gasped. Tears she hadn't given permission for pricked hot behind her eyes. I know, I have to." Because she needed to know if the arrowhead was barbed before she pulled it. Because pulling a barbed point straight out could tear him apart from the inside in ways no amount of yarrow poultice would ever fix. He went still again. Unconscious, or close enough to it that the difference barely mattered. Ingrid sat back, breathed out slow, let herself for one moment feel the full weight of what she was doing. A solitary woman. Not a physician. Not a healer. Not really. Just someone who'd buried a husband and learned enough to keep herself alive out here. What was she doing? What in God's name was she doing? Playing surgeon with a stranger's life, balanced on the edge of a hunting knife. Except there was no one else. Except the nearest town was 2 days' ride in good weather. And this wasn't good weather. This was the tail end of the worst storm she'd seen in 5 years. Except waiting meant watching him die by degrees, and she'd already buried one man she loved. She wasn't about to sit here and watch a stranger go the same way, just because the decision terrified her. So she kept going. The rest of that first day blurred into a rhythm. Warm broth forced between cracked lips whenever he stirred enough to swallow. A poultice of yarrow pressed against the wound, boiled water used to clean what she could reach. The arrow stayed where it was, buried, waiting, a small dark countdown she couldn't stop, and couldn't quite look away from either. Night fell early, the way it always did in the mountains in winter. Ingrid banked the fire high and sat beside him on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, watching his labored breathing rise and fall in the orange light. He looked younger like this, stripped of consciousness, stripped of whatever fierce composure warriors carried into daylight. Just a man. Hurt. Alone in a stranger's cabin, in a stranger's care, with no say in any of it. She wondered about his people. Wondered if somewhere out in that white wilderness someone was already searching. A mother. A brother. Someone whose whole world had gone quiet the moment this man failed to come home. She knew that particular silence herself. Knew exactly how loud it could get. "I won't let you disappear," she told him. Quiet, more promise than comfort. "Whatever else happens. I won't let that happen to whoever's looking for you." He didn't answer. Couldn't, but something in his breathing seemed to ease. Just slightly, like maybe some part of him hurt her anyway. She stayed awake longer than she needed to that first night. Long after his breathing had settled into something almost steady, simply because the silence with another heartbeat in it felt different from the silence she'd grown used to. Fuller, less like a room and more like a home. The second day dawned with no break in the snow. Wind had died completely, though, leaving behind a silence so total it felt like the world was holding its breath alongside her. He drifted in and out. Sometimes his eyes opened and a flicker of awareness passed through them, confused, wary, the particular fear of a man waking somewhere he didn't recognize. Surrounded by someone he'd never chosen to trust. He never looked at her with hostility, though. That surprised her. Just confusion. Just a deep animal wariness that made sense given everything she'd expected, if she was honest with herself. Something closer to fear or fury once, real awareness, returned to him the particular alarm of a man waking to find himself utterly dependent on a stranger twice his reach, in a house he had no way of leaving under his own power. Instead, there was only that careful, measuring stillness, the stillness of someone deciding, moment by moment, whether the person tending him deserved to be trusted, and reserving judgment rather than assuming the worst. It was a kind of grace she hadn't expected from a man, who had every reason to expect cruelty from people who looked like her. She found a small leather pouch tied at his belt while changing the dressing on his wound, hesitated over it a long moment before opening it, feeling like she was trespassing somewhere private, even as her hands moved, dried meat, flint and steel, and wrapped carefully in a scrap of hide, a small carved bone figure. A wolf, she thought, though the carving was worn smooth from handling, like it had passed through many hands before landing in his, a totem, or a gift from someone who loved him. She closed the pouch quickly, set it aside like it might burn her. Because this wasn't just a wounded man on her floor. This was someone's brother, someone's son, someone who mattered to people she'd never met in ways she'd no right to intrude on any further than survival already demanded. Late that afternoon, his fever climbed fast, the way fevers sometimes do when infection finally wins the argument the body's been losing quietly for hours. His skin, so cold before, burned now beneath her palm. He thrashed, weak but thrashing, muttering words she couldn't understand in a voice gone rough with pain. Maybe, please maybe. She couldn't tell, and not knowing made it so much worse. She bathed it with cool water, changed the poultice, dribbled broth and water past his lips, gone dry and cracked whenever he seltzed enough sauce. Well, the arrow sat in him like a clock counting down to something. She had to decide. Tonight, tomorrow at the latest. Ride for help, except there was nowhere to ride to. Not through this snow. Not with anyone in the nearest town likely to help an Apache man bleeding in Ranger's cabin. Or try herself, alone, with a knife and prayer in hands that hadn't stopped shaking since she found him, truly alone. That thought landed harder than she expected because she'd chosen this solitude. Built her whole life around it, brick by brick, log by log, ever since the world made it clear she didn't fit inside its expectations. And now, at the exact moment it mattered most, that same solitude had left her the only thing standing between this man and the grave. No one coming to help. No one to share the weight of the decision, just her. That night, spooning broth carefully between his lips, she saw something shift in his eyes, awareness source. Real awareness for the first time since she'd found him. He focused on her face like he was seeing her clearly, truly for the first time. His lips moved. A word was hoarse, barely audible. She didn't understand it. But she understood the fear underneath it. She set her palm flat against her own chest. Ingrid, she said, slow, clear, then pointed to him, searching for the one Apache word she'd picked up somewhere, from a trader passing through years ago, from Lars, who'd always been curious about the people whose land they'd built their life on. Friend, she tried. The word felt clumsy in her mouth. I'm friend. Something moved behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe. Disbelief, maybe. He tried to speak again, but pain from his side stole the words before they formed, and he coughed instead, dry and rattling. The arrow, she said, pointing to his wound. It has to come out. She mimed barbs, with her fingers desperate for him to the one question that mattered most. He watched her, fever, struggling, and then, so slight she almost missed it, so faint it might have been nothing but a tremor. He shook his head. No barbs, it wasn't much. It might not even have been real. Might have been fever talking instead of him, but it was enough. Hope, thin and fragile as ice on a puddle, flared in her chest anyway. Morning of the third day arrived with a clarity that felt almost cruel after 2 days of white chaos. The storm had finally broken. Sky hard and blue overhead, sun climbing over snow-heavy pines, throwing havers across a world gone silent in a way that felt like something holding its breath. Ingrid built the fire high, boiled water, laid out her cleanest rags and the knife she'd sterilized the night before. I'm going to take it out now, she told him, slow, clear, like the words themselves might somehow cross whatever gap set between their two languages. He watched her, lucid despite the fever, despite everything. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just watched. She knelt beside him. Her stomach twisted itself into something hard and cold. Steady now, she heard, in a voice that wasn't quite her own, that carried the particular warmth of a man 3 years gone. Steady, Ingrid. She took a breath, grasped the slick, broken shaft that rose between 2 fingers. And that was when she noticed it, really noticed it. For the first time, sure, the craftsmanship. She'd handled enough arrowheads over the years. Lars had collected a few, traded for others, and she'd seen plenty more in illustrations, in newspapers, in the stories men told around the few fires she'd ever been welcome at. Army points, crow work, even a few from bands further north. This wasn't any of those. Dark stone, worked thinner than anything she'd seen. Fletching gone, but what remained of the shaft carried markings she didn't recognize at all, small notches cut with a precision that felt almost deliberate, almost like a signature, not army-made, not the work of any raiding party she'd ever heard described, something else entirely. And that realization sat cold in her chest even as her hands kept moving. Because if this wasn't the work of any enemy she could name, then whoever had put this man in the snow wasn't a stranger passing through. It was someone with a reason, a specific one, a personal one. She positioned the blade alongside the shaft, widened the entry point just enough, felt for resistance the way she imagined a barb might feel, though she had nothing to compare it to except instant prayer. The arrowhead caught against something hard. A rib, she guessed. She had to angle down, careful, patient, while every instinct in her screamed to just pull and be done with the waiting. She didn't. Not yet, not until she felt it shift. Finally, a bone, ready to come loose. Now she breathed and pulled. A sound tore out of him that she would hear in her sleep for years afterward. A roar, raw and animal, his back arching off the floor, hands clenching into fists hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Ingrid stumbled back, startled by the force of it. The broken shaft clutched in her fist, dark stone arrowhead, small and smooth and strange against her palm. Blood welled up fast, faster than before. Dark, venous, spreading across the linen she'd laid beneath him. Panic seized her by the throat. She'd done it, but at what cost? The poultice, she gasped. More to herself than anyone, scrambling for the bundle of yarrow and plantain she'd prepared the night before. She pressed it hard against the wound, both hands, all her weight behind it. Because pressure was the only thing standing between him and bleeding out on her floor, he groaned, trembled, eyes rolling back, fainting, or finally, mercifully succumbing to shock. For long moments, Ingrid just knelt there, pressing down, her own heart hammering so loud it drowned out even the fire. Too much blood. That frantic voice in her head wouldn't quiet. Too much, you've killed him. You tried to save him, and instead you've killed him. Except the bleeding slowed slowly. Agonizingly, but it slowed, the yarrow doing quite at work. Yarrow does, and his breathing, though shallow, evened out beneath her palms, alive.
Still alive.
She sat back on her heels, hands stained red to the wrist, and let herself shake for exactly as long as it took to remember there was still work left to do. She cleaned the wound again, bound it tight with strips torn from one of her few good petticoats, because clean linen mattered more right now than modesty ever could. Then she sat back, exhausted in a way that reached all the way down into her bones, and looked at the arrowhead resting on the floor beside her, small, dark, deliberate. Not army. Not any raiding band she could name, something else. A mystery for later, she told herself. If there was a later, through the rest of that third day, he drifted between fever and something close to stillness that frightened her more than the fever ever had. She kept him hydrated. Willow bark tea for the fever. Sips of water whenever his lips parted enough to accept it. She talked to him the whole time, soft nonsense mostly, words that didn't need to be understood so much as felt. As dusk began bleeding purple into the sky outside, she was ladling rabbit stew into a bowl, her own hunger a dull ache she'd been ignoring for 2 days straight. When he stirred again, his eyes opened. Fever bright but clearer than before. He looked at her a long moment, then, in halting English roughened by disuse and pain, words that clearly called something to gather. They will come. Ingrid's hand froze halfway to the bowl. Who will come? He struggled, winced, pressed one hand weakly against his bandaged side like the effort of speaking had reopened something. My brother. He will not stop. Until he finds me. Relief moved through her first. Family. People who loved him, coming to bring him home. Except something in the way he said it, the tension underneath the words. The fear that flickered behind fever-glazed eyes told her. Relief wasn't the whole story. That's good, she said carefully. Isn't it? Your brother coming to find you. He shook his head. Small. Pained. Not good. Because whoever did this, his hand moved, weak, toward the arrowhead still lying dark and small on the floor beside them, is not finished. Which means my brother is walking. Into danger. He does not know. Know what? His eyes found hers. Held them. And for one long, terrible moment she saw something in his face that had nothing to do with fever at all. Fear. Real fear. Not for himself, that the enemy, he said, each word dragged up like it cost him blood to speak it, was never outside our people. Ingrid felt the room tilt slightly around her. What are you saying? But his eyes had already gone distant again. Fever pulling him back under before he could answer, one hand still curled weakly around the edge of the blanket like he was trying to hold on to consciousness by force of will alone. No, she breathed. No, don't, not yet. Tell me what you mean. Nothing, just the rasp of his breathing, uneven, and the crackle of the fur. And somewhere so far off she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it a sound that didn't belong to wind or wolves or anything natural at all. A sound like hoofbeats, distant, muffled by snow, but coming closer, and Ingrid went very still. Whatever he'd meant, whatever secret had followed him into the snow and nearly killed him alongside the storm. She was about to find out when that followed him all the way to her door. The hoofbeats stopped, just stopped, which was somehow worse than if they'd kept coming. Because now Ingrid didn't know where they were. Couldn't track them. Could only stand frozen by the window with her palm still pressed against cold glass. Waiting. For what? She didn't know that either. Her heart slams against her ribs like something trying to get out. She looked back at Tocho. She didn't yet know that name. Not fully, only fragments of it, from his fevered muttering, though she would soon. Fever pulling him under again, his breathing rough and uneven. His hands still curled loose around the blanket edge, like he'd meant to hold on to consciousness and lost the fight. That the enemy was never outside our people. His words wouldn't leave her alone. Wouldn't sit still in her mind the way words were supposed to. They just kept turning over, sharp-edged, cutting something new each time. What did that mean? Who was he running from? If not strangers? If not raiders? If not the kind of enemy a person could point to and name? She didn't have time to chase the answer. Because outside, faint through the walls, she heard something else now, voices. Low, careful. Not Apache. She'd have known that cadence by now, even without understanding the words, because she'd spent 3 days listening to Tocho murmur through fever dreams in a language that had its own particular music. This was different, flatter, harder. English, roughened by cold and something meaner than cold. Ingrid's blood went still in her veins. She moved to the window slow, careful. Kept that eye low, out of the frame, the way Lars had taught her years ago, when wolves came sniffing too close to the stock pen. Except this wasn't wolves, 4 men. Standing at the tree line where the snow hadn't drifted quite as deep. Wolves loose but ready. Furs and buckskin gone gray with trail dirt, the particular grime of men who'd been out in weather far longer than sense allowed. One of them stepped forward. Red beard, thick as a hedge, face weathered into something permanently unfriendly, and something about the way he stood hip-cocked, rifle resting easy against his shoulder like he owned whatever ground he happened to plant his boots on, snagged at a memory. Ingrid didn't want weight. No, except she knew that stance. Knew it the way you know a bruise is about to be pressed before the hand even gets there. She'd seen that exact posture on a boardwalk in Missouri. 4 years ago, in front of half the town. Her stomach dropped clean through the floor. Missouri. She hadn't let herself think about Missouri in longer than she could remember, because thinking about Missouri meant thinking about the particular kind of cruelty that didn't need a weapon to draw blood. Just words. Just a crowd willing to laugh along. She'd been 25 then, newly married, still soft around the edges of herself, still believing foolishly. She thought now that maybe this town would be different than the last one. That maybe, married to Lars, respected as Lars's wife, the whispers would finally stop. If anything, they'd gotten louder, because now there was a story to tell, a joke to make. Big-labbed Lars Halvorsen and his giant bride, ha! Did you see them together? Looks like a bear married a mountain, and there'd been a man. Standing exactly like that man outside her window was standing now. Rifle instead of a whiskey bottle, but the same lazy, cruel confidence. The same voice pitched just loud enough to carry. She remembered his name arriving in her ears before she ever saw his face clearly that day. Silas. Silas Redbourne. A fur trader passing through. Knew enough to town that he didn't know better than to say the quiet things out loud. Look at the size of her. Christ almighty. Bet she could break a man in half and not even notice she'd done it. She remembered the laughter. Remembered Lars's hand tightening around hers. Remembered him starting forward like he might actually do something about it. And remembered stopping him because making a scene would only give the story more legs to run on. She remembered walking home with her spine straight and her eyes dry because she'd learned a long time ago that crying in public only fed people like that. She remembered 3 weeks later, packing everything they owned onto a wagon and leaving that town for good. She remembered, too, the specific shape of Lars's fury in the days between the boardwalk and the wagon, how he'd wanted to find the man and settle it with his fists, and how she'd talked him out of it, not because she thought Redbourne didn't deserve it, but because she'd learned, long before Lars ever came into her life, that a woman built like her couldn't afford to let the men around her fight her battles with violence. It only ever confirmed the story the town already wanted to tell, that she was dangerous, that she required managing, That trouble followed a woman that sighs the way smoke follows fire. So she'd swallowed it instead. Packed the wagon. Told herself the swallowing was strength, because the alternative felt like giving Silas Redborn exactly what he wanted. She'd never once imagined, in 4 years of trying not to think about that boardwalk, that she would ever stand close enough to him again to test which version of herself she'd become since. And now that same man was standing at her tree line with a rifle in his hands and 3 others beside him, hunting a wounded Apache warrior who was currently unconscious on her cabin floor. No, Ingrid breathed barely a sound at all. No, it can't be. Except it was. She forced herself to keep watching. Forced her breathing steady even though everything in her wanted to fold up smalls and disappear. Because panic wouldn't help anyone right now. Panic never split a log or built a wall or kept a dying man breathing through 3 days of fever. She studied the men instead. Really studied them, the way Lars had taught her to study weather before it turned dangerous. Read the signs. Don't just feel the fear. 4 men. Rifles, all of them. One with a coil of rope slung over his shoulder that made her stomach turn for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. They weren't dressed like trappers passing through. Weren't dressed like men heading toward a trading post or a claim. Everything about them said purpose. Said hunt. And they were looking at tracks. She could see it now. The way Redborn crouched near the tree line, one gloved finger tracing something in the snow. Tacho's trail, nearly buried by 2 more days of storm, but not quite gone. Not quite invisible to a man who clearly knew how to read a mountain. He straightened. Said something to the others she couldn't hear. Pointed toward her cabin. Ingrid's whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. She backed away from the window slow. Mind racing through everything at once. Tripping over itself. Unable to land anywhere useful. Because if they knew Tacho had come this way, if they'd tracked him this far, then they already suspected what she now knew for certain. That he was inside, that he was alive, that someone had tried to finish a job that Storm hadn't managed to complete on its own. She looked at Tacho, still unconscious, still fevered, utterly unable to defend himself if those men decided her door wasn't locked tight enough. Her hand went to Lars's rifle, propped by the hearth exactly where she'd left it 3 days ago. Okay, she whispered to herself, to the empty room. Whatever version of courage still lived somewhere underneath 29 years of being told her strength was a problem instead of a gift, okay. Think, Ingrid. Think. She had 1 rifle. 4 men outside with 4 more rifles between them. She had a wounded stranger who couldn't stand, let alone fight. And she had a cabin built solid. Thank God, thank Lars. Thank every hour they'd spent chinking those logs tight. But solid didn't mean impenetrable. Not against 4 armed men with nothing left to lose. And every reason to finish what they'd started. She barred the door, checked the shutters twice. Moved Tacho as far from the window as the small cabin allowed, dragging blankets and all, careful of his wound, careful even now when careful felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Then she waited. The knock never came. That was almost worse. Because a knock would have meant they wanted to talk first, wanted some pretense of civility before whatever came next. Silence meant they were deciding something out there, planning something. Ingrid pressed her back against the wall beside the door, rifle held ready, straining to hear anything beyond her own heartbeat, hammering in her ears, voices. She caught fragments track, tonight. Wait, nothing whole enough to build real meaning from, until one voice rose clear enough to carry through the logs. Redborn's voices. Unmistakable, even 4 years and 1,000 miles removed from that Missouri boardwalk. Not tonight, he said. Easy, almost bored. Storm's given us enough trouble. We'll circle back at first light. He ain't going anywhere. Not with that wound. A pause. Then quieter, almost amused, big woman like that living out here alone. Strange, ain't it? Almost feel sorry for whoever gets in her way, laughter. Low. Ugly. Ingrid closed her eyes. Let the words land. Felt the old shame try to climb back up her throat, and for the first time felt something else answer it back. Quiet and unfamiliar. She was 29. She'd buried a husband. She'd built a cabin with those same hands, split logs with them, dragged a dying man 50 yards through a blizzard with them. And she was done. She realized this with a clarity that surprised her. Standing there in the dark with her back against cold logs, she was completely, finally done, letting a man's laughter decide what her strength meant. Almost feels sorry for whoever gets in her way. She repeated, silent, just her lips moving, tasting the words like something new. You have no idea, Silas Redborn. Outside, the voices faded. retreating toward whatever camp they'd made further down the ridge. For now, she didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Sat instead beside Tocho, rifle across her knees, watching the door like it might betray her the moment she looked away. The fire popped and settled. Wind, what little remained of it, combed low across the roof, and somewhere, out past the trees she imagined, she could still hear the faint murmur of Redbourne's camp. Men talking low around their own tea fire, planning the exact shape of the violence they intended to bring back with the light. She counted her own heartbeats to keep from counting anything worse. Counted the shadows the fire threw across the ceiling. Counted every reason she had to be afraid and set each one down carefully, one at a time, the way you'd set down something sharp you didn't want to hold anymore, but couldn't quite bring yourself to throw away either. Some time past midnight, his eyes opened. Fever bright, but tracking her properly this time. "You are afraid," he said. Voice still rough, still halting, but stronger than before. "I hear it. In your breathing, you should be resting, cannot rest." Not with wolves at the door. His mouth twitched, something close to a smile despite everything. Even wolves who wear a white man's face, Ingrid almost laughed. Almost to the sound caught somewhere in her chest and came out closer to breath than anything else with enough. His hand moved, slow, toward his bandaged side, the one who spoke his voice. "I know it." Ingrid went still. "What do you mean you know it?" Tacho's dark eyes found hers, and something in them had gone hard, focused, fever burning underneath, but clarity too, the particular clarity that pain sometimes carves out of a person. "He is the one," he said slowly, "who paid for the arrow in my side." The words landed like a physical thing. Ingrid felt them settle into her chest, heavy, wrong in a way that reorganized everything she thought she understood about the last 3 days. "Redbourne shot you?" "No." Tocho shook his head, weak, wincing at even that small motion. "Not his hand, his money, his words. I heard them. Before the arrow. Before the dark took me. I don't understand." He closed his eyes a moment. Strengths, this gathering were in was language that clearly cost him more effort than she could fully appreciate. "My people," he said finally, "hold a path through the mountains. Old path, sacred path, leads through paths no wagon has crossed, no mine has touched." His jaw tightened. "Men like him, they want it. Have wanted it long time, so he tried to kill you. Over a mountain pass? Not just me." His hand curled into a weak fist against the blanket. "My brother leads. If my brother dies too, if enough of us die, path becomes empty, no one left to hold it. No one left to say no." Ingrid sat with that a long moment, felt the shape of it settle into something she recognized with sick, cold clarity. Not random violence. Not chance. A calculated, patient cruelty aimed at clearing land of the people who'd always called it home. And Redbourne wants that pass for himself? For men who pay him, Tacho said. He is not the mountain behind this. He is only the arm someone else moves. His eyes found hers again, dark and steady despite the fever. But arm still holds knife. Still cuts just as deep. Ingrid sat back. Let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 days straight. Because this wasn't simple anymore. This wasn't just one wounded stranger and one lonely widow doing the decent thing in a blizzard. This was land, money, men willing to kill for a mountain pass, and other men willing to pay them to do it. And she was standing directly in the middle of it, 4 days into a story she hadn't chosen, in a cabin that suddenly felt very small as guesting gathering outside its walls. "Your brother," she said slowly. "He's coming, you said that already, Klawa." Tacho's voice softened slightly, the way voices do around family names. "He will not stop searching. Not until he finds me. Alive, or he didn't finish that sentence, didn't need to, and when he gets here." "What happens then?" Toke was quiet a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had gone careful, measured. "Depends," he said, "on what he finds. Depends on what story the blood tells him." Ingrid frowned. "What does that mean?" "Means," Tocho said, eyes heavy now, fever pulling him back under despite his effort to stay present. "He will not know friend from enemy at first. Means you must be ready. To prove which one you are." He slipped under again before she could ask anything further. Left her alone with the fire and the dark and the particular terror of understanding. Finally, the true shape of what was coming. Not just Redbourne's men, circling back at first light like wolves, testing a fence line, Klawa. A brother searching for family, armed and desperate, and prepared to see enemies everywhere until proven otherwise. 2 different storms, both bearing down on the same small cabin, and Ingrid Halverson standing directly between them with nothing but a rifle. A wounded man she barely knew, and a truth she couldn't yet prove. She sat with the arrowhead in her palm again, turning it slowly in the firelight, studying that strange, precise craftsmanship that had bothered her from the very first moment, because that detail mattered. She felt it mattering even before she understood exactly why, because if this arrow was deliberately crafted to look wrong, to look like it belonged to no one, or to someone specific she hadn't identified yet, then whoever ordered this ambush had planned for exactly this moment, the moment someone found the arrow and started asking questions. Which meant someone had thought this through, carefully. Someone smarter than four rough men circling a cabin at dawn, which meant Redbourne wasn't the whole story after all. Just like Tucho said, just the arm, not the mind behind it. She set the arrowhead down, rubbed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at every part of her. Whoever you are, she said quietly, to no one, to the dark, to whatever mind had orchestrated all of this, from somewhere far beyond her cabin walls. You picked the wrong woman's doorstep to leave your mess on. The night was not yet finished when dawn arrived, pale and thin, exactly the way Redbourne had promised it would. Ingrid heard them before she saw them, the particular crunch of boots on crusted snow, careful, deliberate. Four sets moving in a loose formation toward her door. She had barely gotten Tocho settled again, barely finished checking the bar across the door for the third time, when the first knock landed, not gentle. Hello, the cabin. Redbourne's voice called, pitched loud enough to carry, friendly in a way that made her skin crawl. We mean you no trouble, ma'am. Just looking for a lost friend of ours. Ingrid stood very still, rifle held ready, positioned to the side of the door where a bullet through the wood wouldn't find her by accident. I don't know what you're talking about, she called back, steady. Steadier than she felt, a pause. Then, closer now, right up against the door itself, that's so. Strange, though, we found tracks leading right up to your porch. Big fella. Apache from the look of it. Wounded pretty bad, we heard. There's no one here but me. Another pause. Longer this time. And when Redbourne spoke again, something in his voice had shifted. Gone flatter. Colder, ma'am. I'd hate for this to get unpleasant. Truly would. But we've got a job to finish, and a lying woman standing between us and finishing it. It ain't gonna change how this ends. Ingrid's grip tightened on the rifle. You'll have to come through this door to find out, she said, silence. Then, low almost to himself, but loud enough she caught it anyway. Well, guess we will then. The first blow against the door landed hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Tacho stirred behind her, fever-glazed eyes snapping open. Alert despite everything his body had endured. They come, he rasped, I noticed Ingrid said, and was almost surprised to hear something close to dark humor in her own voice. Some strange calm settling over her, now that the waiting had finally ended. The second blow came harder, wood groaning, the bar across the door straining but holding. She raised the rifle. Sighted down the barrel at the exact center of the door, right where a man's chest would be if that door gave way, because she wasn't 25 anymore. Wasn't standing frozen on a boardwalk, letting cruel men decide what her size meant. She was 29 years old, alone in a cabin she'd built with her own hands, protecting a life she'd chosen to save. And if Silas Redbourne wanted to test what a giant woman was capable of, standing between him and everything he'd come to destroy, she was more than ready to show him. The third blow never landed, because in the sudden stillness that followed that strange, spended half-second where everyone seemed to be catching their breath, a new sound rose up from somewhere beyond the tree line. A cry high, sharp, unmistakably human, unmistakably a warning, unmistakably not English. Ingrid's blood went cold. Outside, she heard Redbourne curse, heard the scramble of boots retreating from her door, heard rifles being raised toward the tree line instead of toward her. Christ, one of the men breathed, voice carrying clear through the walls. There's a whole damn war party out there. Ingrid moved to the window fast, heart hammering, and looked out at a sight that stole the breath clean out of her lungs. Riders, a dozen at least, maybe more, emerging from the tree line with a silent, terrible grace. Horses picking careful paths through drifted snow. Buffalo robes, feather catching the pale morning light. Rifles and bows held ready, faces set with an expression that needed no translation at all. At the front, mounted on a black war pony with a single white blaze down its nose, rode a man who radiated authority even from this distance. Older than Tacho, a long scar tracing down one side of his face, pulling his mouth into a permanent hard line. Ingrid didn't need anyone tell her who that was. Klawa, she breathed. Behind her, Tacho struggled up onto one elbow, face pale, eyes fixed on the window with something between relief and pure terror. My brother, he said. He has come. Is that good? Ingrid asked. Though some part of her already suspected the answer, Tacho's eyes met hers, and for the first time since she'd found him bleeding in the snow, she saw real fear there. For himself or her. Depends, he said quietly, echoing his own words from the night before, on what he decides you are. Redbourne's men didn't wait to find out what the war party intended. Ingrid watched through the window as all four scrambled back toward the tree line, rifles raised, shouting to each other in voices gone ragged with panic. Ambush. One of them screamed, and then everything happened at once. Klawa's rifle came up first, fired before the echo of that scream had even faded, and the mountain answered with a volley from a dozen more weapons hidden among the trees. One of Redbourne's men went down clutching his shoulder. Another stumbled, cap torn clean off by a bullet that came within inches of taking far more than that. Ingrid prepped herself flat against the wall beside the window, heart slamming, watching a war she hadn't started explode across the snow in front of her home. Redbourne himself dove behind a snowdrift, firing wild, his earlier confidence gone completely, replaced by the particular desperation of a man realizing too late he'd badly misjudged the odds. Two of his men were down within the first minute. The third turned to run and made it maybe 10 yards before a shot from somewhere in the trees dropped him where he stood. The whole scene had a strange, disjointed quality to it, the way violence often does to the people forced to witness it up close for the first time sound, arriving a half-beat behind the muzzle flash that caused it, snow kicking up in small white bursts that seemed, for one absurd moment, almost beautiful, before her mind caught up and reminded her what each burst actually meant. She had read about battles in the few newspapers that made their way out to the mountains, had pictured them as something distant and orderly, lines of men facing each other across open ground. This was nothing like that. This was chaos with a shape only the warriors themselves seemed able to read, each of them moving through it with a fluency that spoke of lifetimes spent learning exactly the kind of terrible choreography. A stray shot from Redbourne's own scattered defense punched through her window frame not 2 feet from where she stood, spraying splinters across her cheek close enough that she felt the wind of it before she heard the crack of the rifle that sent it. Ingrid dropped instinctively, heart slamming so hard it hurt, glass and wood dust settling into her hair. For one long, breathless second, she understood with total clarity exactly how close this had all come to ending differently, how a single inch, a single gust of wind, a single moment's hesitation from anyone involved could have turned this into a story with an entirely different woman lying dead on this floor. She pressed her palm flat against the wall beside the shattered pane, breathing hard, and made herself stand back up anyway. Redbourne alone remained standing, crouched low, firing in short, desperate bursts toward warriors, who moved through the chaos like they'd trained for exactly this their whole lives. Ingrid watched, transfixed, horrified, unable to look away even as every instinct told her to duck lower, to hide, to let this violence resolve itself without her Except this was still her land, her doorstep, and the man cowering behind that drift had spent 4 years living rent-free in her worst memories, had shown up at her home, threatening to break down a door with a dying stranger inside. She thought of Missouri, thought of that boardwalk, that laughter, that particular cruelty that had followed her 1,000 miles and still hadn't learned when to stop. She thought of Lars's rifle, still gripped tight in her hands, and something in her chest went very, very still. For one held breath, she thought of every version of herself that had ever stood frozen, while a man like this one decided what she was worth. The girl in Minnesota who'd learned to duck her head in doorways before she'd even finished growing into the height that required it. The bride in Missouri who'd walked home dry-eyed because crying would have only fed the story further. The widow who'd built solitude around herself rather than risk one more room full of laughter aimed at the wrong target. She thought of all of them standing behind her now, somehow crowded into this small cabin doorway alongside her. None of them had ever gotten to choose what happened next. She didn't decide to move toward the door. Not exactly. It felt more like her body had already decided for her, the way instinct sometimes outpaces thought entirely. She lifted the bar, pulled the door open just enough to see, rifle raised, sighting down the barrel toward the unfolding cross across her own front yard. Redbourne had broken from cover, sprinting now toward the tree line, toward whatever escape route his panicked mind had settled on. 2 warriors moved to cut him off, but he was closer to the trees than they were, close enough that he might actually. Ingrid sighted down the barrel, breathed out slow, the way Lars had taught her years ago, patient, steady, and fired. The rifle bucked hard against her shoulder. Redbourne cried out, stumbled, went down hard in the snow, clutching his thigh. Rifle spinning away from his grip into a drift 10 feet distant. He didn't get back up. Ingrid stood in her doorway, smoke curling from the barrel, and watched the man who'd haunted her for 4 years crawl through blood-stained snow, utterly defeated, utterly harmless now, exactly the way cruelty always looked. Once you finally stopped being afraid of it, there was no triumph in the moment. She noted that distantly, almost surprised by it. Just a kind of grim, quiet clarity. She'd protected her home. She'd protected the man dying on her floor. And she'd done it without needing anyone's permission to be exactly as strong as she'd always been. 4 years, she realized distantly, watching him claw uselessly at reddening snow. 4 years she'd carried that boardwalk around with her like a stone sewn into her coat lining, heavy in a way she'd stopped noticing until this exact moment, when the weight of it finally lifted. Silas Redbourne had spent 4 years living large and unchallenged in her memory, a villain grown bigger with every retelling her own mind gave him in the dark, and here he was in truth, just a man, bleeding into snow. No crowd left to laugh along with him, no power left to make her feel small ever again. She almost laughed. Didn't, because laughing over a wounded man felt like its own kind of cruelty, but the urge surprised her all the same, that particular, dizzying relief of finally seeing a monster reduced to its true, unremarkable size. The fighting ended almost as quickly as it had begun. Within minutes, the last of Redbourne's men lay either dead or disarmed in the trampled snow, and an eerie silence settled back over the clearing, broken only by groans from the wounded and the low murmur of warriors. Securing the area with practiced efficiency, Ingrid lowered her rifle slowly. Her whole body trembled now that the moment had passed, adrenaline draining out of her all at once, leaving something shaky and hollow behind. She'd shot a man. Wounded him, at least. There was no triumph in that thought, only a kind of grim, exhausted weight settling into her chest. Klawa approached on foot now, having desisted somewhere in the chaos, his rifle held loose but ready, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made every hair on her arms stand up. He stopped, a few feet away, studied her a long moment, studied the rifle still smoking faintly in her hands, studied the blood staining the snow behind her, studied the open cabin door and whatever lay beyond it. Then his gaze sharpened, fixed past her shoulder, toward the interior of the cabin, toward his brother. Ingrid watched something complicated move across his scarred face. Relief, maybe. Fury, maybe. She couldn't tell which emotion was winning, and that uncertainty terrified her more than Redbourne's men ever had, because Tocho had warned her. Depends on what he decides you are. And now, standing in her own doorway with a stranger's blood and a rifle still warm in her hands, Ingrid Halvorsen had no idea which way this moment was about to break. Klawa's hand moved toward the knife at his belt. And behind her, weak but urgent, she heard Tocho's voice call out something sharp in his own language. A warning, a plea, she couldn't tell which. The whole clearing seemed to hold its breath. Klawa's hand didn't stop moving toward that knife. Ingrid felt her whole body lock up, rifle still warm in her grip. Blood, Redbourne's blood staining the snow, something out of a nightmare she hadn't finished waking from yet. Because this was it. This was the moment Tocho had warned her about. The moment where all her care, all 3 days of fever and broth and yarrow poultice, might not matter at all. Not if his brother decided the wrong thing in the next 5 seconds. Wait, she said, too loud, too fast. Wait, please. Tocho's voice cut through first, weak but sharp enough to carry a single word, then another Apache, urgent, unfamiliar. She still didn't know the language, still couldn't tell one syllable from the next, except she understood tone, understood urgency, understood a brother begging another brother to stop. Klawa's hand froze on the hilt of his knife. He didn't draw it, he didn't sheath it either. For one long, terrible stretch of silence, nobody moved. Not Ingrid, not Klawa, not the dozen warriors fanned out behind him, rifles and bows still raised, faces unreadable in the pale morning light. Then Klawa's eyes moved, away from her, past her shoulder, toward the open cabin door, toward whatever lay just inside it, toward his brother. Something shifted in his face, just slightly, a crack in all that hardness. He said something low, urgent, stepped forward. Ingrid didn't move out of his way. Couldn't, not yet. Not until she understood which version of this moment she was standing inside. He's hurt, Seat, she said, slow, clear. pointing toward the cabin, toward Tocho, praying tone would do the work language couldn't. I helped him. I didn't hurt him. Klasvia's gaze snapped back to her, sharp, assessing. He looked at the rifle in her hands, at the blood on the snow, at her, this tall, broad-shouldered white woman, standing between him and his brother like she had every right to be there. And for one awful second, Ingrid watched him decide she was the enemy. No, she said before she'd even finished thinking the word. Stepped sideways. Let him see past her, into the cabin, to where Tacho lay propped weakly against the wall, blankets tangled around him, face pale but eyes as open. Watching. Klawa's breath caught. He moved past Esther without another glance, dropped to his knees beside his brother, hands finding Tocho's face, his shoulders, checking him the way you check something you were certain you'd already lost. Tacho said something, soft, his hand closing weakly around Klawa's wrist. Klawa's shoulders shook, just once. He said nothing back. Just pressed out his forehead briefly to his brother's, eyes closed, and in that single, unguarded moment, Ingrid saw exactly how much fear this man had been carrying. Since the storm first swallowed his brother whole, then he straightened. Turned back toward her, the hardness had returned to his face, but something else moved underneath it now too. Confusion, maybe, because his brother was alive, bandaged, cared for. In the home of a woman he'd been ready 30 seconds ago to consider an enemy. He barked something over his shoulder. Two warriors dismounted, moved toward the cabin, weapons still ready but no longer aimed at her. Klawa stood in front of her a long moment, studying. His eyes dark, sharp. Missing nothing moved from the rifle in her hands to the fresh blood on the snow, to the arrowhead she still, somehow, had in her coat pocket, forgotten there, since the night before. She remembered it suddenly, fumbled it free with fingers gone clumsy from cold and adrenaline both. This, she said, holding it out on her open palm. Small, dark, precisely made. I took it out of him. Just yesterday, Klawa's gazed fixed on it. He leaned closer, studied the craftsmanship the exact same way she had, days earlier, alone by her own fire. His jaw tightened. He knew it too. Knew, the same way she'd known, that this wasn't the work of any enemy he could easily name. He looked up at her, and this time when he spoke, his voice had lost some of its edge. Not friendly, not yet, but listening. She thought of every rumor she'd half listened to over 3 years of solitude talk, from the rare trader who passed through, talk of surveys, talk of railroad men and mining men circling these mountains like buzzards, waiting for something to finish dying so they could pick the bones clean. She'd never once let herself connect those rumors to anything real, had told herself it was simply talk, simply the noise men made when they had more ambition than sense, except here it was, written down and signed. Proof that the noise had always had teeth behind it, patient and well-funded and entirely willing to spend Apache's like currencies, in a transaction the men doing the spending would never have to witness firsthand. It was ambushed, Ingrid said, slow, careful, using her hands where words wouldn't reach, pointed at the arrowhead, pointed toward the trees. Not by your people. By him, she gestured toward Redbourne, still crumpled in the snow, groaning weakly, clutching his ruined leg, and men like him. Klawa's eyes moved to Redbourne, held there a long moment. He said something sharp to 2 of his warriors, who crossed the clearing and hauled Redbourne up by the collar, none too gently, dragging him toward the cabin. Ingrid watched Redbourne's face twist with pain and fear in equal measure, watched the man who'd terrorized 4 years of her memory reduced to exactly what he'd always been underneath the bluster. Small, cruel, and now finally afraid. From where he sat propped against the wall, Tocho watched all of it. Watched her stand her ground through the whole ordeal without once looking away, and something in his expression, when their eyes briefly met across the chaos, was not fear anymore. It was something closer to wonder. They brought him inside, dropped him near the hearth, where Kwaklaha crouched in front of him, dark eyes utterly without mercy. Ingrid hadn't expected him to speak English so easily. She's assumed, wrongly it turned out, that the language between them would remain as halting as it had been, with Tacho. Later, she would learn Klawa had spent two as a boy at a mission post near Fort Bowie, sent there in the uneasy years after the reservation lines were first drawn, back when his own father still believed education might be armor against whatever was coming. He'd hate it, had run twice. But the words had stayed with him long after the mission itself had not, the way unwanted gifts sometimes do. He said something. English this time, rough but clear as snuff. Who sent you? Redbourne's face went pale. I don't know what you're... Klawa's hand moved, fast. closed around the collar of Redbourne's coat, hauled him half upright despite his wounded leg, despite the way he cried out from the movement. Who? Klawa said again, quieter this time, which somehow made it worse. Sent you. Ingrid watched, heart pounding, caught somewhere between horror and a grim satisfaction she didn't examine too closely. Redbourne's eyes darted toward her. Desperate, pleading almost, like he thought she might intervene on his behalf. She said nothing. There's a satchel, she said instead. Quite. To Klawa, not to Redbourne. Outside. By the tree line, I saw it fall when he went down. One of the younger warriors retrieved it, brought it inside, dropped it at Klawa's feet. Ingrid knelt, opened it herself, hands steady now in a way that surprised her. Papers inside. Folded, damp from the snow, but legible. A contract. She scanned it fast, the words swimming a little before they settled into meaning. A mining concern. A payment schedule. Map crude, but unmistakable, marking a mountain pass through Apache land, the exact route Tocho had described to her 2 nights before, and a name, Josiah Kettering. Signed at the bottom in a careful, deliberate hand, alongside a sum of money large enough to make Ingrid's stomach turn. There, she breathed. There it is. She held the paper up, turned it so Klawa could see, even though she doubted he read English well enough to make full sense of it. He's not the one who wanted this, she said, pointing at Redbourne, then tapping the signature at the bottom of the page. This man is someone who's never even set foot on this mountain. Paying other men to clear it for him, Klawa took the paper from her hands, studied it a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. Then he looked at Redbourne again, and this time, something in his expression had shifted entirely. Not just anger anymore. Understanding. You did not choose to hate us, he said slowly, each English word deliberate, careful like he was testing the shape of them. You chose money instead. Redbourne said nothing. Just stared at the floor, all his earlier bravado gone completely, stripped away by fear and blood loss and the sudden total collapse of whatever plan had brought him to this mountain in the first place. Which is worse, Klawa said quietly. Not really a question, Ingrid stood back. Let this moment breathe, because it wasn't really hers to fill. But something was still bothering her. Some detail that hadn't settled, right since she'd first pulled that strange, precise arrowhead from Tocho's side. Because the craftsmanship, the deliberate strangeness of it, made to look like it belonged to no one at all. That wasn't Redbourne's doing. Men like him didn't think in details that fine. That kind of care took someone who understood exactly how suspicion would move once the arrows was found, someone who wanted the blame to land nowhere specific at all. Wait, she said, half to herself. She knelt back down beside the satchel, dug deeper. Found tucked beneath the papers a second item wrapped in oilcloth, a small pouch. Leather-worn soft with handling. She opened it. Inside arrowheads. A dozen, maybe more, all identical, all carved with that same strange, precise strangeness she'd puzzled over for 3 days straight. He didn't make this one, she said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, each one colder than the last. Kettering did, or someone working for him. Made these specifically, so that if was a clear effort found, she looked up at Klawa, no one would know who to blame. Not your people, not settlers, just nobody. A ghost. Klawa took the pouch from her hands, turned one of the arrowheads slowly between her jaw tight. A weapon, he said, built to hide the hand that threw it. Yes. Clever, he said, and the word came out bitter as frost. For a coward, he set the pouch down, looked at Redbourne one final time, something final settling into his expression. You will answer, he said, for what you did to my brother, not to me. To your own people's law, if it still means anything on this mountain, he straightened. But the man who paid you, who sits somewhere far from this snow, clean hands, warm fire. He looked at Ingrid. He answers to something larger. Ingrid stood in the doorway a long moment after the papers had been gathered, and Redbourne led away, looking out at a clearing gone quiet again, snow already beginning to soften the worst of what had happened there. She thought about Josiah Kettering, a man she had never met and likely never would, sitting somewhere warm and comfortable while other men bled and froze and killed on his behalf. She thought about how easy it must be from that kind of distance to reduce a mountain pass and the people who held it to numbers on a payment schedule. Money made cowards of men in a particular way. Violence rarely could it let them commit their cruelty by proxy, at arm's length, clean-handed, and sleep soundly afterward because their own fingers had never once touched a weapon. She wondered, not for the first time that morning, how many other cabins like hers existed scattered across these mountains. How many other quiet arrangements had already been signed and dated and folded into satchels just like this one, waiting for their own storms to bring them to light? The next hour blurred into practical motion. Klawa's warriors bound Redborn's wound well enough to keep him alive, for whatever justice waited for him. Ingrid didn't ask what form that would take, and some quiet, exhausted part of her decided she didn't need to know. The other fallen men were dealt with according to customs she didn't fully understand and didn't feel with such a question. Tacho, meanwhile, was carefully examined by an older warrior who'd ridden with the party, someone whose weathered hands moved over the wound with a gentleness that told Ingrid, more than any words could, that he trusted her work. He said something to Klawa. Klawa's shoulders eased, just subtly. Klawa translated, watching her carefully. The wound was cared for well. Better than most would have managed. Better than some of our own healers might have, so far from proper medicine. Ingrid felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the moment she first found Tocho in the snow. I didn't know what I was doing, she admitted. Most of it, and yet, Klawa said he lives. Tocho, propped weakly against the wall, managed a faint smile at that. She argued with me, he said, voice still rough but steadier now, about the arrow. Whether it had barbs, you could barely speak, Ingrid said. I could shake my head. His smile widened, just slightly. Almost, she repeated, and felt something in her own chest crack open despite everything, some small, unfamiliar warmth pushing through 3 days of fear and exhaustion. You nearly let me guess wrong. I trusted you, he said simply, before I understood why. Klawa watched this exchange a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes' assessment, still but softer now, less suspicion. Something Ingrid didn't yet have a name for. He stepped toward her, studied her the way he had outside, but differently now. Not looking for a threat. Looking, she realized closely, for something else entirely. My brother says you carried him, he said. 50 yards through the worst storm this mountain has seen in years. He wasn't light, Ingrid said, and immediately regretted how flippant it sounded, except Klawa's mouth twitched not quite a smile, but closest. No, he agreed. He is not. He looked at her a moment longer, at her height, her shoulders, the particular solidness of her that had cost her so much, once in a town 1,000 miles from this mountain. In my language, he said slowly, there is no word for what you are. Woman who carries a warrior through a blizzard. Woman who takes an arrow from flesh with steady hands. Woman who faces 4 rifles alone and does not run. Ingrid felt heat rise in her face, unexpected, unfamiliar after so many years of hearing her size discussed only as a problem to be solved. I'm just tall, she said, quieter than she meant to. Klawa's eyes held hers. No, he said. You are not just anything. He reached then, unhurried, and drew a single eagle feather from where it hung, tied at his own a small belt, and unremarkable to look at, except for the careful, deliberate way he kept it fastened. There among the warrior's gear that clearly mattered. This is not the naming, he said, pressing it into her palm before she could protest. The naming comes later, properly, when my brother is strong enough to speak it himself. This is only so you remember before then that today was real, that you did not imagine any of it. Ingrid closed her fingers around the feather, throat tight. I don't need reminding, she said. I don't imagine I'll forget any of this as long as I live. No, Klawa agreed. Something almost gentle moving behind his scarred, careful face. But grief has a way of making people doubt their own good days, once enough time has passed. I have seen it happen to stronger men than either of us. Keep the feather. Let it argue with the doubt. When the doubt comes, 2 days passed before Tocho was strong enough to travel. 2 days of quiet mornings and careful conversations, of Klawa's warriors setting up camp just beyond the tree line, close enough to guard the cabin, far enough to give her privacy. 2 days of watching Tocho's strength turns in slow, steady increments, coming back to his face, his voice growing clearer, his laugh. When it finally arrived on the second evening, low and warm and startling in how much it changed his whole face. You laugh like a man who nearly died 3 days ago and forgot to be grateful about it, Ingrid told him, only half teasing, sitting across the fire while he worked, feeling back into fingers still stiff from cold. I am grateful, he said, every breath. But grief and joy, he considered his words carefully. They can sit at the same fire. I learned this when my father died. I did not stop laughing forever. I only learned laughter could hold sorrow inside it too. Ingrid sat with that a long moment. Thought of Lars. Thought of 3 years spent mostly in silence, mistaking grief for something that required her isolation as tribute. I think I forgot that, she admitted quietly. Somewhere along the way. Then perhaps, Tocho said, the mountain sent me to remind you. They fell, in those 2 quiet days, into a small unspoken rhythm. She taught him the English word for things around the cabin fire, water, roof, snow, and he taught her back the Apache word for the same, his pronunciation patient, even when her tongue mangled the sounds badly enough to make him laugh outright. Again, he'd say not unkindly, and she'd try again, and eventually, by the second afternoon, she could manage a handful of words without stumbling too badly over them. It was a small thing, ordinary, even, but Ingrid found herself treasuring it anyway, the particular, uncomplicated pleasure of learning something new beside another person. After 3 years of a life that had offered her nothing new to learn at all, she noticed too how differently the cabin sounded, with 2 voices in it instead of one. The silence she'd built her whole life around these past 3 years had never once felt like peace, not really, no matter how many times she'd told herself otherwise. It had simply been the absence of noise, which was a different thing entirely from the presence of comfort. Now the kettle's whistle meant something, because someone else was listening for it too. Now the fire's particular pop and settle became punctuation in a conversation instead of the only voice in the room. She caught herself, more than once, watching Tacho's hands as he worked, feeling back into his fingers, and thinking of Lars's hands doing the same small ordinary tasks, years ago, whittling, mending, reaching for her across the narrow space between her and Wantus. It wasn't the same feeling. She was careful with herself about that. Careful not to let grief borrow a new man's face simply because loneliness made the borrowing easy. But it was, she thought, a related feeling. A cousin to what she'd lost, if not its replacement. On the second night, with Klawa's fire glowing steady beyond the tree line and the cabin gone quiet around them, Ingrid finally remembered the totem. She retrieved it from its pouch, held it out to him on her open palm, firelight catching the worn grain of the wood. I found this, she said, days ago. I didn't mean to pry, but your belt pouch, I had to move it, to move you, and I saw it, and I couldn't stop looking at it since. Tacho's face changed the moment he saw it. Something soft moved through his features, and something else beneath the soft part, something closer to grief. My cousin carved this, he said quietly. Chodi. Before he stopped, started again. Before he left our people, 2 summers ago, he went to work for the white surveyors. For money. For promises no one should have trusted. Ingrid felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, the way it had the first time Tocho had told her the enemy was never outside their people. The arrowhead, she said slowly. The notches. They match. Tacho's jaw tightened. He didn't look surprised. Only tired, in the particular way grief tires a person long before it ever finishes with them. Chodi always was skilled with his hands, he said. I did not want to believe it could be him. I still do not want to. But wanting has never once changed what is true. Is he, Ingrid asked carefully, one of the men who came for you? No, Tacho shook his head. He is smarter than that. He would not risk his own hands on it. He only sold the knowledge, the paths, the timing. The season we would be weakest, moving between camps. His hand curled into a fist against the blanket. He sold his own blood for a white man's coin, and let strangers do the killings so his own conscience could stay clean, enough to sleep at night. Ingrid said nothing for a long moment. Just sat with him in the firelight, the totem resting between them like a small wooden wound. I'm sorry, she finally said. That's a particular kind of grief. Losing someone who isn't dead. Tacho looked at her sharply, something like surprise moving behind the sorrow. You understand that, he said. Not quite a question. I buried my husband, Ingrid said. That grief has an ending, even if it doesn't feel like one some days. But the other kind, losing someone who's still walking around somewhere, choosing every day not to come back. She shook her head. I watched my own mother live with that. A brother who chose a different life and never once looked back. She grieved him for 30 years like he was already in the ground, except he never had the decency to actually die and let her finish. Tocho studied her a long moment. Grief without a grave, he said slowly, testing the words. Yes, that is exactly the shape of it. He closed his hand gently over the totem, over her fingers still holding it, and for a moment neither of them moved. Keep it, he said. Tucho, it's yours. Your cousin made it for you, which is why I am giving it away, he said. A gift from a man who no longer exists, given to a woman who saved my life despite owing me nothing. Let it mean something new now. Let it stop being his and start being, he considered, searching for the word, a promise. That not every hand that shapes something beautiful uses it towards something cruel. Ingrid closed her fingers around the small carved wolf, throat tight in a way she didn't examine too closely. I'll keep it safe, she said. I know, Tacho said. That is why I trust you with it. On the morning they were finally set to leave, Klawa approached her one last time, alone without his brother beside him. He carried something in his hands, a small bundle, wrapped carefully in soft hide. A gift, he said, extending it toward her. For what you did, Ingrid unwrapped it slowly. Inside a beaded pouch, intricate work, clearly made with care and time and skill she couldn't fully appreciate, but recognized as valuable all the same. You didn't have to, I know, Klawa said, cutting her off gently. That is why it matters. He studied her a long moment. Then, careful, deliberate, he spoke words that clearly cost him some effort to translate properly. My people have a way of naming those who prove themselves beyond doubt. Not given lightly. Earned only through action no words could match. Ingrid felt her breath catch. Among my people, he continued, there is now a name spoken of you, passed already between the warriors who stood outside your door. Who watched you face 4 rifles without flinching? Who watched you carry my brother's weight like it was nothing at all? He said something then, in his own language, low and formal, the syllables unfamiliar but carrying a weight she felt even without understanding them. In your tongue, he said, it means something close to giant woman. Ingrid stood very still. For 29 years that word giant had been a wound. A joke told behind hands, a whisper following her down boardwalks, a reason men like Silas Redbourne had once felt entitled to laugh at her in public and call it harmless. And now it was being offered to her differently. Not as mockery, as honor. As something earned in blood and snow, and 3 days of refusing to let fear decide what she was capable of. I don't, her voice caught. She tried again. I don't know what to say to that. You do not need to say anything, Klawa said. You have already said it. With your hands. Your rifle. Your refusal to close your door when the storm brought my brother to it. Tacho, watching from he sat wrapped in blankets near the fire, caught her eye. Something warm passed between them, unspoken, the particular understanding that grows between two people who face death together and come out the other side changed by it. You saved my life, he said. Twice. Once from the storm. Once from men who wished to finish what the storm could not. You gave me something too, Ingrid said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. I forgot, somewhere in 3 years alone, that I was allowed to matter to someone. You reminded me, Tocho smiled, slow and genuine. Then perhaps this is not goodbye. Only until what? Until the mountain brings us together again, he said. It has a way of doing that. I've learned to trust it. They rode out an hour later, Tocho secured carefully on a travois between 2 horses, Klawa leading, the rest of the warriors falling into formation behind them. Redbourne, bound and silent, was brought along as well, his fate now a matter for others to decide. Ingrid stood in her doorway and watched them go. Watched the line of riders shrink slowly against the vast white wilderness until they disappeared entirely into the tree line, swallowed by the same mountains that had nearly swallowed Tocho 3 days before. The silence that settled afterward felt different than the silence she'd known for 3 years, not empty, just quiet. The particular quiet of a held breath finally released. She looked down at the beaded pouch still resting in her palm. At the word Klawa had given her, still settling into some new shape inside her chest, something she suspected would take longer than 1 afternoon to fully understand. Giant woman, not a joke anymore. Not a cruelty tossed from a boardwalk by men who never once bothered to know her. A name earned. A name that belonged to her. Finally, on her own terms. She thought of Lars then, the way she always did in moments like this, his voice moving warm and certain through her memory. Every soul's worth saving, Ingrid. Even when it's inconvenient, I know, she said aloud. To the empty tea clearing, to the mountains, to a husband 3 years gone, who still somehow managed to be right about everything. I know, Lars. I finally understand what you meant. Spring would come eventually. It always did. Even to mountains this stubborn, this unforgiving. The snow would melt. The tracks in the clearing would fade. The blood staining the ground beneath fresh drifts would disappear entirely beneath new grass by summer. But some things, Ingrid understood now, standing alone in her doorway with a stranger's gift warm in her hand, some things didn't fade nearly so easily. A name, given freely by people who owed her nothing. A warrior's laugh, low and warm beside her fire, and the particular, hard-won understanding that the very thing the world had once called her curse had turned out, all along, to be exactly the gift it took a blizzard and a bleeding stranger to finally reveal. She closed the door slowly, back toward a fire still burning steady in the hearth. And for the first time in 3 long years, the cabin didn't feel quite so much like a place to hide. It felt, instead, like a place worth being found. In the days that followed, Ingrid found herself doing something she hadn't done in the whole years of her solitude. She left the shutters open past dark, even when the cold argued against it, simply to watch the way moonlight settled differently over snow that no longer felt quite like a wall between her and the rest of the world. She found herself talking less to Lars's memory and more to the empty room itself, as though the room had earned the right to be spoken to directly, now that it had held more than grief inside its walls. She kept the beaded pouch on the shelf nearest the door, where she'd see it first thing each morning and last thing each night. She kept the eagle feather tucked beside it, and some mornings before she'd fully decided to. Her fingers found their way to both without her quite meaning to reach for them, at all the way a person's hand finds a locket, or a wedding ring, or any small object that has become a shorthand for an entire chapter of a life. Weeks later, when the first hard melt finally came and the mountain trail was turned to mud instead of ice, a rider appeared at the tree line one morning, alone, unhurried. Ingrid recognized the horse before she recognized the man in the black coat, the single white blaze, and her heart did something complicated and unfamiliar in her chest before she'd even opened the door. Tocho dismounted slow, favoring his heeled side out of habit more than necessity now, and stood for a moment just looking at the cabin like a man confirming a memory against the real thing. "You said the mountain has a way," Ingrid called from the doorway, arms crossed, doing her best not to smile too openly, and failing anyway. "Of bringing people back together, I did say that." He came closer, close enough that she could see he was healing well. Color returned fully to his face, the particular ease of a man no longer measuring each breath against pain. "I did not say how long it would take me to admit I wanted to test whether I was right." She laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she hadn't let herself use freely in longer than she wanted to count. "Come in," she said. "The fire's already going." He glanced past her once at the doorframe Lars had built too tall for anyone but her, and something in his expression suggested he understood, without needing to be told, exactly whose hands had shaped this home and exactly what it had cost her to open its door to a stranger in the first place. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't need to. Some understandings arrive whole, without translation, the way his brother's warning had arrived to her days ago, through nothing but tone and urgency. He did. And for the first time since Lars had gone, the particular ache of an empty chair by her hearth didn't feel quite so much like absence. It felt, instead, like a chair simply waiting for the right person to finally sit down in it.